Good evening and a very warm welcome to Sleep Tales. I am so glad you have chosen to join me here tonight. This channel is a quiet place, a safe harbor for you to rest your mind and let the stories guide you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin our journey tonight, if you enjoy this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps our small community grow. You could also leave a like on the video and perhaps a comment to let me know where in the world you are listening from. It is always a wonder to see how far these stories travel. Now, find a comfortable position. Allow your body to feel heavy and relaxed. Let go of the day and let my voice be your guide. This is the story of Tessa, a 19-year-old girl who lives on a small island and works as a deckhand on the ferry her father captains. Her world is the short stretch of water between her quiet island home and the bustling mainland. While she loves the sea and her simple life, she quietly dreams of the vast, unknown world beyond the horizon. The story follows Tessa's journey after a family crisis forces her to leave the comfort of her home. She must face a world that is much bigger and more challenging than she ever imagined. It is a story about duty, grief, and finding the courage to become the person you need to be, not by escaping your home, but by learning to lead it. Chapter 1: The Rhythm of the Tide. The first light on Sea Light Island was not a bright announcement. It was a slow, quiet secret shared between the sea and the sky. It began as a soft gray line far to the east, a place where the dark water seemed to spill into the dark air. Then, the gray would soften into a gentle pearl color. This light would touch the highest point of the island first, a small, rocky hill where an old, unused lighthouse stood as a silent monument to a different time. From there, the light would creep down the green slopes, over the fields where sheep slept soundly, and between the small painted houses of the village that huddled around the curve of the bay. The light moved like water itself, flowing down the single main street, touching the closed shutters of the general store and the dark windows of the small post office. It was a gentle waking, a slow and predictable turning of the world that Tessa had known for all of her 19 years. Inside her small room, in a cottage that smelled of salt and wood smoke, Tessa was already awake. She did not need an alarm clock. Her body was tuned to the island's clock, to the subtle shift in the air that came just before the dawn. She lay still for a moment, listening. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic wash of waves on the shore and the gentle creak of the old house around her. Her window was open just a little, and the air that drifted in was cool and clean, carrying the smell of the low tide, a mixture of wet stone and salt and life. Her room was simple. The walls were painted a pale blue, the color of the sky on a clear summer morning. The floor was made of wide wooden planks, worn smooth by generations of her family. A small, sturdy desk sat under the window, and on it was a neat pile of books. Above the desk, the wall was not blue. It was covered in maps. There was a large map of the world, with the great oceans seeming vast and full of possibility. There were other maps too, more detailed ones showing the complex coastlines of faraway lands, places with names that sounded like music or magic to her. One map showed the currents of the North Atlantic, a web of blue lines showing the powerful, invisible rivers that flowed through the sea. This was her private world, her quiet rebellion against the smallness of her life. She looked at the maps every morning and every night, tracing the long sea routes with her finger, imagining the feel of a different ocean under a different sky. She loved her home. She loved the island with a deep and quiet certainty, but her heart held a restless curiosity. She wondered what it was like to be on a ship that sailed for days without seeing land, to feel the long, slow roll of the deep ocean, to see stars in the sky that she could not see from her own window. She pushed back the warm, heavy quilt and swung her legs out of bed. The wooden floor was cool beneath her bare feet. She moved quietly through the small cottage, her steps making almost no sound. In the kitchen, a single weak bulb cast a soft yellow light over the simple room. Her mother was already there, a quiet presence by the stove, making coffee. They did not speak much in the mornings. There was no need. Their lives were a shared rhythm, a comfortable dance of familiar movements. Tessa poured herself a glass of water and drank it while looking out the small kitchen window. The sky was now a soft pink and orange, and the dark shapes of the fishing boats in the harbor were becoming clear. She could see Finn, a young fisherman about her age, already on his boat, mending a net under the glow of a single lamp. He worked with a steady, practiced motion, his hands moving surely in the dim light. He was a part of the island's rhythm, just as she was. He belonged to the sea in his way, and she belonged to it in hers. After dressing in her work clothes, a pair of dark, sturdy trousers and a thick wool sweater, she pulled on her heavy boots. She stepped outside into the cool morning. The air was still and quiet. The village was just beginning to stir. A light came on in the window of the general store, and Tessa knew Mrs. Gable was inside, preparing for the day. Mrs. Gable was a kind woman with a face full of wrinkles from a lifetime of smiling. She knew everyone on the island, and her store was the center of all news and gossip. Tessa walked down the gentle slope of the street toward the docks. Her boots made a soft, crunching sound on the gravel path. The smell of the sea grew stronger, cleaner. A flock of gulls cried out as they circled over the water, their calls sharp and lonely in the quiet air. The harbor was calm, the water a dark, smooth mirror reflecting the growing light in the sky. Tied to the largest dock was the ferry. It was called the Tide Runner. It was not a beautiful boat. It was wide and practical, built for work, not for speed. Its paint was a faded blue, chipped and peeling in places to show the gray metal beneath. Patches of rust showed near the waterline, like old scars. But to Tessa, the Tide Runner was the most important thing in the world. It was her family's boat, their livelihood, their connection to the world beyond the island. It was the heart of Sea Light Island, pumping people and supplies back and forth in a steady, reliable beat. Tessa stepped onto the cool steel of the ferry's deck. The boat shifted slightly under her weight, a familiar and comforting movement. She knew every inch of this vessel. She knew the particular groan the ramp made when it was lowered. She knew which latch on the side gate was stiff and needed a firm push. She knew the spot on the railing that was always coldest to the touch, even on a warm day. She began her morning checks, her movements efficient and sure. She walked the perimeter of the car deck, her eyes scanning the heavy chains and the thick rubber bumpers. She checked the ropes, coiling a loose one with a few quick, expert turns of her wrist. The rope was thick and rough in her hands, the familiar texture a comfort. She opened a heavy hatch and peered down into the engine room. The air that rose up was warm and smelled of diesel and oil. The massive engine was silent, a sleeping giant waiting for the command to wake. Everything was as it should be. The ferry was ready. His face was weathered, carved with deep lines, the skin tanned from a lifetime of sun and wind. His hair was short and gray, and his eyes were a pale, piercing blue. He wore the simple, dark uniform of an instructor, but he stood with the unshakable stillness of a captain on the bridge of his ship. This, she knew from the welcome packet, was Mr. Cormack, the head instructor of the academy. He did not smile. He simply looked out at the sea of new faces before him, his gaze sweeping across the room. His eyes seemed to miss nothing. He began to speak, his voice not loud, but deep and gravelly, with a rough edge to it, like the sound of stones being rolled by the tide. His voice commanded attention. He did not welcome them in the usual way. He did not speak of the grand traditions of the academy or the bright futures that awaited them. He spoke about the sea. He told them that the sea was not their friend. It was not their enemy. It was a vast, powerful, and indifferent force of nature. He said that the sea did not care about their family names, their wealth, or their ambitions. The sea, he said, only respected skill, discipline, and knowledge. He told them that the academy would be hard. It would push them to their limits and beyond. He said that many of them would fail. He said that was a good thing, because it was better to fail here in the classroom than to fail out there on the water where the cost of failure was measured in lives. As he spoke, Tessa felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. His words were harsh, but they were true. They were real. This was a language she understood. This man was not like the cold, smiling businessman who had tried to buy her family's life. This was a man of the sea. His words were a challenge, but they were a fair challenge. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance here. Maybe skill and discipline were things she could learn, things she could prove. After the speech, the students were dismissed to find their first classes. Tessa looked at the piece of paper in her hand. Her first class was navigation theory. She found the right classroom. It was a large room with a steeply sloped floor, like a small theater. The chairs were arranged in long, curved rows, all facing a large blackboard at the front. Tessa chose a seat in the middle, not too close to the front, but not hiding in the back either. The room quickly filled up. The arrogant young man she had seen earlier came in with his friends and took a seat in the front row. He was still talking and laughing, completely at ease. The instructor came in, a thin, serious man with glasses. He began the lesson immediately, and Tessa's small flicker of hope began to die. The instructor started writing on the blackboard. He covered it in numbers and strange symbols, in long, complex equations. He spoke of things like spherical trigonometry, celestial mechanics, and azimuth calculations. The words were a foreign language to her. She had learned navigation from her father, by sight, by feel, by a deep, instinctual understanding of the water and the coastline. She knew how to read a chart, how to use a compass. But this was something else entirely. This was the abstract science behind it all, a world of pure mathematics. She tried to follow along, tried to write down the notes like the other students, but her mind could not make sense of it. The numbers and symbols on the page were just a meaningless jumble. She felt a familiar, sinking feeling of panic, the same feeling she used to get in math class in her small island school. The instructor asked a question, a long, complicated question about calculating a theoretical position based on star sightings. The room was silent for a moment. Then, the arrogant young man in the front row raised his hand. The instructor called on him. "Julian," he said. The young man, Julian, stood up and answered the question with a smooth, easy confidence. His answer was long and detailed, full of the same technical terms the instructor had been using. The instructor nodded, impressed. "Excellent, Mr. Croft," he said. Croft. The name of the large shipping company that had tried to buy their route was Croft Maritime. This was Julian Croft, the son of the man whose company was trying to ruin her family. The realization hit Tessa with the force of a physical blow. Her antagonist now had a name and a face, and he was sitting in the front row, effortlessly succeeding where she was completely and utterly failing. The rest of the day was no better. In her maritime law class, she was faced with thick textbooks filled with dense, legal language that was almost impossible to understand. In engineering principles, the instructor talked about thermodynamics and fluid dynamics, concepts that were completely alien to her. Tessa, who could diagnose a problem with the Tide Runner's engine just by the sound it made, could not understand the complex diagrams and formulas on the page. She felt a growing sense of despair. She was a fraud. She did not belong here. She had made a terrible, foolish mistake. She had taken her family's life savings, their only hope, and she was going to waste it. At the end of the day, she walked back to her small, lonely room, the weight of her failure pressing down on her. The city seemed louder and more menacing than before. She felt Julian Croft's dismissive gaze on her back. She could almost hear him laughing at the stupid ferry girl who thought she could become a captain. She spent that evening, and many evenings after, in the Academy's library. It was a vast, silent room with shelves that reached all the way to the high ceiling, filled with thousands of books. She sat at a small wooden desk, surrounded by stacks of textbooks, trying to force the knowledge into her head. She read the same pages over and over, the words blurring in front of her tired eyes. The numbers and formulas swam before her, refusing to make sense. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of information she could not understand. Her isolation was complete. The other students formed study groups, working together to solve the difficult problems. They would gather at tables in the library, their heads bent together, their low voices a murmur of shared understanding. Tessa was always alone. No one invited her to join them. She was the quiet girl from the island, the one who never knew the answers in class. She was invisible. Julian Croft and his friends would sometimes be in the library, and she would watch them from a distance. They never seemed to struggle. They would finish their work quickly and then leave, their laughter echoing in the quiet halls. They were from a different world, a world of privilege and easy success. Tessa felt a bitter resentment toward them, but she also felt a deep and painful sense of her own inadequacy. The only moments of relief came in the practical lessons. Once a week, they had a class on practical seamanship, taught by Mr. Cormack himself. These classes were held not in a classroom, but in a large workshop near the docks, a place that smelled of rope and tar and old wood. Here, Tessa was in her element. When they were taught how to splice a rope, her hands, so clumsy with a pen, moved with a fluid, confident grace. She could do it perfectly on the first try, her fingers weaving the strands together with a speed and precision that came from years of practice. When they were taught a series of complex knots, the kind used on large sailing ships, she already knew them all. Her father had taught them to her when she was a little girl, treating it as a game. Mr. Cormack noticed. He would walk through the workshop, his sharp eyes watching everyone. He did not offer praise easily. But one afternoon, as Tessa was showing another struggling student how to tie a particularly difficult knot, he stopped and watched her. He did not say a word. He just watched her hands, his expression unreadable. When she was done, he gave a single sharp nod of approval before moving on. It was a small gesture, but for Tessa, it was a lifeline. It was the first time since she had arrived that anyone had acknowledged that she had any skill at all. It was a confirmation that her past, her life on the ferry with her father, was not worthless. It had value. Julian Croft saw it too. He was struggling with the same knot, his smooth, clean hands clumsy and slow. He saw Mr. Cormack's nod to Tessa, and his handsome face tightened with annoyance. He looked at Tessa, his eyes filled with a new kind of contempt. It was no longer just dismissal. It was a resentful dislike. He muttered something to his friend, just loud enough for Tessa to hear. "Show off! It's all a ferry girl is good for." The words were a small, sharp sting, but they were also fuel. The anger and the injustice of it all hardened into a cold, fierce resolve. She would not let him win. She would not let this place break her. She would work harder. She would stay later. She would prove to him, to everyone, and most of all to herself, that she was more than just a ferry girl. She was the daughter of a captain, and she would become a captain too. Chapter 5. Learning the Stars. The days at the Maritime Academy settled into a hard, grueling routine. Tessa's life became a simple, repeating pattern of classroom, library, and her small, lonely room. She woke before the sun, the faint city glow a pale imitation of the dawn she was used to. She would sit at her small desk, a single lamp pushing back the darkness, and read until her eyes burned. She would review the notes from the day before, trying to force the complex theories and mathematical formulas to stay in her head. It felt like trying to build a stone wall with handfuls of dry sand. The information just slipped through her mind, leaving behind only a frustrating residue of confusion. In the classroom, she remained silent. She never raised her hand to answer a question, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of drawing the attention of Julian Croft and his friends, afraid of revealing the true depth of her ignorance. She listened intently, her pen scratching across the pages of her notebook, trying to capture every word, every diagram, hoping that if she wrote it all down, it would somehow, magically, begin to make sense. She felt a constant, low-level anxiety, a knot in her stomach that tightened whenever an instructor asked a question she could not answer. Her small victories in Mr. Cormack's practical seamanship class were a double-edged sword. They gave her a much-needed taste of competence, but they also made her a target. Julian Croft, who continued to be clumsy and slow with the physical tasks of a sailor, seemed to have decided that Tessa was his personal rival. He found small, cruel ways to remind her of her place. He would make comments, just loud enough for her to hear, about how some people were good with their hands because they were not good with their minds. He would accidentally bump into her in the crowded hallways, sending her books scattering across the floor. They were small, childish acts of malice, but they had their intended effect. They made her feel even more isolated, even more like she did not belong. She did not react. She would simply pick up her books, her face a blank mask, and walk away. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her anger or her hurt. She channeled all of that emotion, all of that frustration, into her work. The library became her true home, her sanctuary, and her battlefield. She was relentless. She was the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave at night. The librarians began to recognize her, giving her a small, sympathetic smile as she checked out yet another stack of books. She discovered that if she broke the huge, complex subjects down into their smallest possible parts, she could begin to understand them. She would take a single equation from her navigation class and spend an entire evening on it, looking up the meaning of each symbol, reading about the history of its discovery, finding simpler examples in older, more basic textbooks. It was a slow, painstaking process. It was like trying to learn a new language one word at a time. But slowly, very slowly, it began to work. A few of the abstract concepts started to become a little less blurry. She started to see the faint outlines of the logic that held them together. She formed a tentative friendship with another student, a quiet, serious young man named Ben. Ben was not from a wealthy shipping family. His father was a mechanic who worked on fishing boats in a small town down the coast. Like Tessa, Ben was an outsider. He was not a target of Julian's cruelty, but he was largely ignored by the popular, confident crowd. Ben was good at the academic work, but struggled with the practical lessons. He was intelligent, but not a natural sailor. They began to help each other. In the evenings, they would find a quiet corner of the library. Ben would patiently explain the difficult concepts of engineering to Tessa, drawing simple diagrams to illustrate his points. In return, in the workshop, Tessa would show him the proper way to coil a rope or the fastest way to tie a bowline knot. They rarely spoke about their personal lives. Their friendship was built on a foundation of shared struggle and mutual respect. It was a small, quiet connection, but for Tessa, it was a lifeline in her sea of loneliness. One afternoon, they had a class in the ship simulator. This was a class that everyone was excited about. The simulator was in a large, dark room. In the center of the room was a perfect replica of the bridge of a modern cargo ship. There was a captain's chair, a large wheel, and an array of complex control panels filled with screens, buttons, and levers. The windows of the bridge were actually massive, high-definition screens that could project a completely realistic 360-degree view of the sea. The whole room was on a hydraulic platform that could move and tilt, perfectly mimicking the motion of a ship on the water. It was the closest they could get to being on a real ship without leaving the campus. The lesson for the day was storm navigation. Mr. Cormack was the instructor. He stood in the corner of the dark room, a silent, observant presence. The students were to take turns at the helm, each one guiding the simulated ship through a sudden, violent storm. It was a test of everything they had been learning. Julian Croft, of course, was the first to volunteer. He strode to the captain's chair with his usual arrogance. He looked completely comfortable, his hands moving surely over the controls. Mr. Cormack gave the signal, and the simulation began. The calm, sunny day projected on the screens around them quickly darkened. The sea, which had been a flat blue plain, began to churn. The platform beneath them began to roll and pitch. The sound of wind and rain filled the room. Julian was a model student. He followed the procedures from the textbook perfectly. He gave calm, precise orders to the other students who were playing the role of his crew. He kept the ship headed directly into the waves, the standard procedure for maintaining control in a storm. He was doing everything by the book, but the storm in the simulation was designed to be unpredictable. A rogue wave, much larger than the others, suddenly appeared on the screen, a massive wall of water bearing down on them from a slightly different angle. The textbook procedure was to hold the course. But Tessa, watching from the side, felt a jolt of recognition. The situation was almost identical to the one she had faced with her father on the Tide Runner. She remembered how her father had not held the course, how he had made a small, sharp turn to meet the wave at a slightly different angle, a more stable one. Julian did not make that turn. He held his course just as the textbook said. The simulated wave crashed over the bow of the ship. The platform lurched violently, and a loud, blaring alarm sounded, indicating that the ship had taken on a dangerous amount of water. She climbed the narrow metal stairs to the upper deck. Here, there were rows of simple wooden benches for the passengers who wanted to sit outside. The wood was worn smooth and gray from years of sun and salt spray. She ran her hand along the back of one of the benches. She had helped her father varnish these benches last winter, the two of them working in silence, the only sounds the scrape of sandpaper and the cry of the gulls. At the front of the upper deck was the wheelhouse, a small room with large windows that looked out over the bow of the ferry. This was her father's domain. She entered quietly. Captain Alistair was already there, standing at the window, looking out at the mainland, a dark line on the horizon. He was a tall man, quiet and strong, with a face that seemed to be carved from the same weathered rock as the island's cliffs. His eyes were the color of the sea on a cloudy day, a deep and thoughtful gray. He did not turn as she entered. He did not need to. He knew her footsteps as well as he knew the tides. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Morning, Dad," Tessa replied. She went to the small counter where a coffee pot was already brewing, filling the small room with a warm, rich smell. This was their ritual. Every morning, they shared a cup of coffee in the wheelhouse before the first crossing of the day. It was a time of quiet connection, a shared moment before the work began. Tessa poured 2 mugs of the dark, strong coffee. She handed one to her father. He took it without looking away from the window. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who had worked with ropes and engines his entire life. They stood together in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee as the sun finally broke free of the horizon, sending a brilliant path of golden light across the water. The light filled the wheelhouse, illuminating the details of the room. The large wooden wheel, polished smooth by her father's hands. The brass throttle, gleaming softly. The charts spread out under a sheet of protective glass, covered in his neat, precise pencil marks. Taped to the wall was a single faded photograph. It was of a much younger Alistair, with his arm around Tessa's mother, Tessa herself a small child in his other arm. They were all smiling, squinting in the bright sun. Tessa watched her father. He had a way of standing that was perfectly still, yet completely aware of everything around him. He was a part of the boat, and the boat was a part of him. He had taught her everything she knew about the sea. He had taught her how to read the water, to see the subtle shifts in color that spoke of changing depths or hidden currents. He had taught her how to tie every kind of knot, his large hands guiding her small ones until the movements became second nature. He had taught her the names of the seabirds and the constellations in the night sky. He rarely used many words. His teaching was in his actions, in his quiet confidence, in the steady presence that had been the anchor of her entire life. She finished her coffee and placed the empty mug on the counter. It was time. The first passengers would be arriving soon. She left the wheelhouse and went back down to the car deck. The sun was higher now, and the day was beginning in earnest. Cars began to roll down the ramp onto the ferry, their engines a low hum. There were the regulars, the construction workers heading to a job on the mainland, the doctor who commuted every day, the high school students who attended the larger school across the water. Tessa directed them into their places with simple hand signals, her movements clear and easy to understand. Foot passengers began to walk on, carrying bags and lunch boxes. Tessa greeted them with a quiet smile or a nod. She knew most of them by name. They were her neighbors, the people she had grown up with. They trusted her, and they trusted her father to carry them safely across the water every day. Soon, the ferry was loaded. Tessa raised the heavy steel ramp, securing it with a loud, solid clang. She unlooped the thick mooring ropes from the posts on the dock, tossing them onto the deck with a practiced flick of her wrist. She gave the signal to the wheelhouse, a sharp, two-fingered whistle. A moment later, she felt the deep, familiar vibration as her father started the engine. The low thrum resonated through the steel deck, up through the soles of her boots. It was a sound of power, of purpose. The tide runner shuddered gently and then began to move, pulling away from the dock with a slow, steady grace. Tessa stood at the stern, watching Sea Light Island grow smaller. The houses of the village became small, colorful boxes. The old lighthouse on the hill stood tall against the morning sky. She watched until the island was just a green and gray shape in the distance. Then she turned and faced the mainland. The mainland was a different world. It was a long, dark stretch of land that grew larger and more detailed as they approached. Soon she could make out the buildings of the town, the cars moving along the coastal road, the large cranes of the commercial port further down the coast. The mainland was a place of noise and speed, a place of strangers. It was a place of endless roads that led to other towns and cities, to places she had only seen on her maps. The crossing was smooth. The water was calm, a deep, sparkling blue under the morning sun. A cool breeze blew across the deck, carrying the clean, sharp smell of the open sea. Tessa walked the deck, her hands in her pockets, her eyes scanning the water. This was the part of her job she loved the most, the time when the ferry was a self-contained world moving between two places. It was a time of quiet reflection. She felt a sense of peace on the water, a feeling that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But with that peace came a familiar restlessness. She would look past the mainland to the horizon where the sky met the sea in a clean, sharp line. She wondered what was out there, beyond that line. She had read in her books about the vastness of the ocean, about storms that could last for days, about waves as tall as mountains. She had read about the strange and beautiful creatures that lived in the deep, dark water. She had read about the sailors who navigated by the stars, trusting their lives to the tiny points of light in the infinite blackness. Her life was this short 20-minute crossing, back and forth, back and forth. It was a good life. It was a safe life. But was it enough? She leaned against the railing, the cool metal a solid presence against her back. She watched a pod of dolphins break the surface of the water, their sleek gray bodies arching gracefully through the waves before disappearing again. They were free. They could go anywhere. They were not bound to this small stretch of water. Sometimes she felt like the ferry itself, strong and reliable, but fixed on a single unchangeable course. Her father was happy with this life. The ferry was his whole world. He had never shown any desire to captain a larger ship, to sail the great oceans. His contentment was a source of comfort for Tessa, but it was also a mystery. How could he not feel the pull of that distant horizon? How could he not wonder what lay beyond? Maybe he was wiser than her. Maybe he had found a kind of freedom in his duty, a kind of peace in his predictable routine. Tessa hoped that one day she would feel that too. But for now, the dream of the wider world was a constant, quiet hum in the back of her mind. The mainland harbor grew closer. The sounds of the town reached them across the water. The distant sound of traffic, the clang of a bell, the faint shouts of people. Tessa's brief time of reflection was over. It was time to get back to work. She went to her station at the bow of the ferry. Her father expertly guided the tide runner into its berth at the dock. The ferry bumped gently against the thick rubber fenders with a soft thud. Tessa was ready. She grabbed a rope and with a single powerful throw sent it flying through the air to a waiting dockhand who looped it over a thick metal post. She secured her end of the rope, pulling it tight. She did the same with a second rope, making the ferry fast to the dock. The engine quieted, its low thrum fading to a gentle hum. Tessa lowered the ramp, its heavy steel grating against the concrete of the dock. The crossing was complete. The cars began to roll off, their drivers giving her a quick wave of thanks. The foot passengers walked down the ramp, merging into the morning crowds of the mainland town. For a little while, the ferry was empty and quiet again. It would wait patiently for the return journey, for the people who needed to go back to the quiet world of Sea Light Island. Tessa stood on the deck, watching the busy life of the town. She felt like an observer, a visitor from another place. She did not belong here. Her place was on the water, in the space between the two worlds. She looked back in the direction of her island, but it was too far away to see. There was only the wide blue water and the endless sky. She took a deep breath of the salt air. The day was still young. There were many more crossings to make before the sun would set. The rhythm of the tide would continue, and she would continue with it. Chapter 2: The Storm Within. The day continued in its usual rhythm. The tide runner made its steady crossings, back and forth, a reliable shuttle on the blue water. The morning sun warmed the deck, and the sea remained calm. Tessa worked with her usual quiet efficiency, her movements so practiced they required no thought. She coiled ropes, directed cars, and answered the simple questions of the few tourists who were visiting the island for the day. She spoke with Finn, the fisherman, when he came aboard to buy fuel from their small reserve, his hands smelling of fish and salt. She shared a sandwich with her father during the brief lull in the middle of the day, the two of them sitting on a bench in the sun, the silence between them comfortable and full of unspoken understanding. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be. But as the afternoon wore on, a subtle change began to creep into the air. It was nothing that a person from the mainland would notice. It was a slight shift in the quality of the light, a barely perceptible change in the feel of the wind. Tessa noticed it first. The sunlight, which had been bright and clear, now seemed to have a thin, hazy quality to it, as if she were looking at the world through a fine, invisible veil. The blue of the sky seemed less vibrant, a little faded. She looked to the west, toward the open sea, and saw a long, thin line of high, wispy clouds that had not been there an hour before. They looked like delicate white feathers brushed against the pale sky. She had seen clouds like that before. Her father had taught her that they were often the first sign of a coming change in the weather, the advance messengers of a distant storm system. She went up to the wheelhouse. Captain Alistair was standing at the window, just as he had been that morning, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had noticed it too. His face was calm, but his eyes were narrowed slightly, and there was a stillness in his posture that told Tessa he was paying close attention to the world outside the ferry. "Looks like the weather might turn," Tessa said, her voice quiet. Her father nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the sea. "The forecast said clear all day," he said, more to himself than to her. "But the sky says something different, and the birds are flying low." Tessa looked out and saw that he was right. The gulls, which usually soared high in the air, were now flying close to the surface of the water, their wings beating with a quick, urgent rhythm. It was another sign, another piece of the language of the sea that her father had taught her to read. They were on their way back to Sea Light Island, and the crossing was still smooth, but the feeling of unease lingered. It was a quiet tension that settled in the small wheelhouse. The world outside the windows still looked peaceful, but they both knew how quickly the sea could change. They knew that its calmness was not a promise, only a temporary state. They docked at the island, unloaded the passengers and cars, and prepared for the final crossing of the day back to the mainland. By now, the change in the weather was more obvious. The thin, wispy clouds had thickened into a solid gray bank that was slowly advancing from the west. The wind had picked up, and it now had a colder, sharper edge to it. The water in the harbor was no longer a smooth mirror. It was choppy, and small white caps were beginning to form on the waves. A few of the islanders waiting to board the ferry looked nervously at the sky. They trusted Captain Alistair completely, but they also had a deep respect for the power of the sea. Tessa worked quickly, her movements sharp and focused. She made sure every car was securely chained down, checking each one twice. She walked the deck, ensuring all loose equipment was stowed away and every hatch was tightly secured. She felt a familiar knot of nervous energy in her stomach. It was not fear, but a heightened state of awareness, a readiness for whatever was to come. As the tide runner pulled away from the island for the last time that day, the sky to the west was a dark, bruised purple. The sun was hidden behind the thick wall of cloud, and the world was cast in a strange, gloomy light. The ferry, which had felt so steady and solid all day, now began to move with a different rhythm. It began to rise and fall with the growing swell of the waves, a long, rolling motion that Tessa could feel deep in her bones. The wind was stronger now, and it howled as it rushed past the wheelhouse. Rain began to fall. At first, it was just a few scattered drops, but soon it became a heavy, driving downpour that lashed against the windows and turned the deck into a slick, dark surface. The sea, which had been blue and friendly just a few hours before, was now a churning chaos of gray and white. Waves, much larger than before, crashed against the bow of the ferry, sending huge plumes of spray high into the air. The spray hit the windows of the wheelhouse with a sound like thrown gravel. Tessa stood beside her father, her hand resting on the back of his chair for balance. He was calm. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, his movements small and precise as he guided the ferry through the rough water. He was not fighting the sea. He was working with it, anticipating the movement of each wave, adjusting their course to meet it at the best angle. His face was a mask of concentration, his eyes constantly moving, reading the water, looking for the safest path through the storm. Tessa watched him, her admiration for his skill mixed with a growing sense of fear. She had been in storms before, but this one felt different. It had come on so quickly, with so much violence. The ferry groaned under the strain. The whole vessel seemed to cry out as it was lifted up by a massive wave and then slammed down into the trough with a jarring thud that shook every plate of steel. The few passengers on this final crossing were huddled inside the small enclosed cabin, their faces pale and worried. Tessa knew she should go down and check on them, offer them a word of reassurance, but she could not bring herself to leave her father's side. The storm grew worse. The wind screamed, a high, thin sound that seemed to get inside her head. The rain was so heavy that it was almost impossible to see. The world outside the windows was a blur of gray water and gray sky. Her father switched on the powerful searchlight, its bright beam cutting a path through the deluge, illuminating the terrifying dance of the waves in front of them. He was a master at his work. He was in complete control, his decades of experience guiding his every move. He was the calm center of the storm, the anchor in a world that had gone mad. But Tessa could see the strain on his face. Tiny beads of sweat were visible on his forehead, even in the cool air of the wheelhouse. His knuckles were white where he gripped the wheel. This was not just a job for him. It was a deep and profound responsibility. He was responsible for the boat, for the people on it, for his daughter standing beside him. Suddenly, a huge wave, larger than any before it, rose up out of the darkness. It was a moving wall of water, its crest a line of churning white foam. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. Her father turned the wheel sharply, meeting the wave head-on. The bow of the tide runner rose up, 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 climbing the face of the wave. For a moment, it felt as if they were going to be launched into the sky. Then, they were over the crest, and the ferry plunged down the other side. The impact as they hit the water below was violent. Tessa was thrown against the wall, her shoulder hitting the hard steel with a painful thud. Alarms began to blare from the control panel, their loud, insistent beeping adding to the chaos of the storm. A red light was flashing, indicating that one of the cars on the deck below had broken its chains and was shifting. "I need to go," Tessa shouted over the noise of the wind and the alarms. Her father gave a sharp, quick nod, his eyes never leaving the violent sea in front of them. Tessa pulled open the heavy door of the wheelhouse and stepped out into the full force of the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. The rain was like icy needles against her skin. She held on to the railing, her hands gripping the cold, wet metal as she made her way carefully down the slippery stairs to the car deck. The scene below was one of controlled chaos. The one car that had broken loose, a large delivery truck, was sliding with the roll of the ferry, its tires screeching against the wet steel. If it hit the side of the ferry with enough force, it could cause serious damage. Tessa knew what she had to do. She grabbed a heavy chain and a block from the storage locker. She waited for the ferry to roll in the opposite direction, and as the truck slid away from her, she ran across the deck. She was soaked to the skin in seconds, her hair plastered to her face. The sea spray was so thick it was like breathing water. She managed to wedge the block under one of the truck's wheels. Then, as the ferry rolled back, the truck sliding toward her, she worked frantically to attach the heavy chain to its axle. She had to get the hook in place and secure it before the full weight of the truck came down on it. Her fingers were numb with cold, but she worked with a desperate speed. She got the chain attached just in time. The ferry rolled again, and the chain pulled tight with a loud groan, holding the truck in place. It was secure. Tessa stood for a moment, her hands on her knees, gasping for breath, the adrenaline coursing through her. She had done it. She felt a surge of pride, a feeling of competence even in the midst of the storm. She made her way back up to the wheelhouse, her body aching, her clothes dripping water onto the floor. Her father glanced at her, a look of deep relief in his eyes. "It's secure," she said, her voice hoarse. He just nodded, his attention already back on the difficult task of navigation. The worst of the storm seemed to pass them then. The wind did not lessen, but the waves became more regular, less chaotic. Her father had found a rhythm, a way to move with the sea instead of against it. Through the pouring rain, Tessa began to see the faint, familiar lights of the mainland harbor. They were getting closer. They were going to make it. A feeling of immense relief washed over her. She watched her father, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but his hands still steady on the wheel. He was her hero, a quiet, unassuming man who became a giant in moments like this. He guided the tide runner toward the narrow entrance of the harbor, a delicate and difficult maneuver even in calm weather. In this storm, it was a supreme act of skill. He navigated the ferry past the rocky breakwater, the waves crashing against the stone with a sound like thunder, and then they were inside the harbor. The water was suddenly, miraculously calm. The force of the storm was broken by the protective arms of the land. The ferry glided through the smooth water toward its dock. The engine noise lessened as her father slowed their approach. The alarms had been silenced. The only sound was the drumming of the rain on the roof and the heavy, ragged sound of her father's breathing. Tessa felt a wave of exhaustion hit her. Now that the danger was over, her body was beginning to feel the effects of the adrenaline and the cold. She looked at her father. He was leaning heavily against the control panel, his face pale, his skin slick with sweat. "Dad?" she said, a note of concern in her voice. "Are you okay?" He did not answer. He just shook his head slightly, as if trying to clear it. He reached for the throttle to make the final adjustment for docking, but his hand was shaking. He missed the lever. He tried again, his movements clumsy. Tessa watched him, a cold feeling of dread beginning to spread through her chest. Something was wrong. "Dad, let me," she said, stepping forward. But he waved her away, a stubborn set to his jaw. He was the captain. He would bring his ship in. He managed to get the ferry to the dock, though the landing was rougher than usual, a heavy bump that sent a shudder through the vessel. As soon as they were stationary, he shut down the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. And in that silence, Captain Alistair collapsed. He fell to the floor of the wheelhouse with a heavy final sound. Tessa cried out his name. She rushed to his side, her mind unable to process what was happening. He was on the floor, his eyes closed, his face a ghastly shade of gray. He was breathing, but in short, shallow gasps. The happy detail of their teamwork, of their shared victory over the storm, had turned into a sad and terrifying nightmare. For a moment, Tessa froze. Her world, which had been so solid and predictable, had just shattered. Her father, the strong, unshakable center of her life, was lying helpless on the floor. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was now raging inside her. But then, her training, her discipline, kicked in. She could not fall apart. Not now. Her father needed her. The passengers needed her. She was no longer just a deckhand. In that moment, she was the only one in charge. She grabbed the radio, her hand trembling so hard she could barely hold it. She keyed the microphone. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," she said, her voice surprisingly calm and clear. "This is the Tide Runner. We are at the mainland dock. We have a medical emergency. Our captain is unconscious. We require immediate medical assistance." She gave their location, her words precise and automatic. Then she went to the door and shouted down to the passengers, telling them to remain calm, that help was on the way. She knelt beside her father again, her hand on his chest, feeling the faint, rapid beat of his heart. The minutes stretched out, feeling like hours. She could hear the distant wail of a siren growing closer. She stayed by his side, speaking to him in a low, quiet voice, telling him that everything was going to be okay, that help was coming, that he just needed to hold on. She was not sure if he could hear her. She was not sure if she was trying to reassure him or herself. The chapter ends with Tessa watching a team of paramedics carry her father on a stretcher down the ramp and into a waiting ambulance. The red and blue lights of the ambulance flashed in the pouring rain, painting the dark, wet world in strobing colors of panic and fear. The ferry, her home, her sanctuary, suddenly felt cold and empty and terrifyingly silent. The storm had passed, but Tessa knew with a dreadful certainty that the real storm was just beginning. Chapter 3: An Uncharted Course. The world outside the ambulance was a blur of rain and flashing lights. Tessa sat on a small, hard seat, her body pressed against the cold wall of the vehicle as it sped through the wet streets of the mainland town. She could not stop shivering, though she was not sure if it was from the cold of her soaked clothes or the shock that had settled deep in her bones. Across from her, 2 paramedics worked on her father. He was lying on a stretcher, very still, with tubes and wires attached to him. The inside of the ambulance was filled with the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, a sound that was both terrifying and reassuring. It was a sign of life, but it was also a constant reminder of how fragile that life was. Tessa could not take her eyes off her father's face. In the harsh, sterile light of the ambulance, he looked older and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. The strong lines of his face seemed to have softened, and his skin was a pale, waxy color. His eyes were closed, and his usual calm expression had been replaced by a deep, unsettling stillness. Tessa felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a scene from a movie, and it was not really happening to her. Just a short time ago, they had been in the wheelhouse, fighting the storm together. He had been strong, in command, a giant. Now he was helpless. The thought was so overwhelming that she had to close her eyes for a moment. She tried to focus on her breathing, on the simple act of pulling air into her lungs and pushing it back out. It was a small anchor in the chaos that was swirling around her and inside her. The journey to the hospital was short, but it felt like an eternity. When they arrived, the back doors of the ambulance were thrown open and a team of doctors and nurses was waiting. Her father was wheeled quickly inside through a set of wide double doors, and then he was gone. A nurse, a kind-looking woman with tired eyes, gently guided Tessa toward a small waiting room. The room was painted a pale, calming green, but it did not feel calm. It felt tense and full of a quiet, anxious energy. There were a few other people in the room, their faces etched with worry. Tessa sat down on a hard plastic chair, and the nurse told her that a doctor would be out to speak with her as soon as they knew anything. And so she waited. The minutes crawled by. Tessa was acutely aware of every small detail of the room. The faint, antiseptic smell in the air, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Each tick of the second hand sounded like a hammer blow in the quiet room. She was still in her wet clothes, and a small puddle of water was forming on the polished floor beneath her chair. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the shivering. She felt completely alone. Her mother was back on Sea Light Island, unaware of what had happened. There was no ferry running now. The island was cut off. Tessa had her phone, but she did not know what to say. How could she explain this? How could she put this terror into words over the phone? So she waited in silence, lost in a fog of fear and disbelief. After what felt like a lifetime, but was probably only an hour, a doctor came into the room. He was a tall man with gray hair and a serious, compassionate face. He looked at Tessa, his expression gentle. He told her that her father had suffered a major heart attack. The strain of fighting the storm had been too much for his heart. He said that they had managed to stabilize him, and for now he was out of immediate danger. The words, "out of immediate danger," were a small island of relief in an ocean of fear. Tessa felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, and she gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. The doctor continued to speak in a calm, measured voice. He explained that her father would need a long period of recovery. He would need rest and quiet, and he would have to be on medication for the rest of his life. And then came the words that would change everything. The doctor looked at her directly and said, "He can never work on the ferry again. He can never be a captain. The physical strain, the stress, it would be too much. His heart simply cannot handle it." The words were delivered with a gentle finality, like a door being quietly but firmly closed. Tessa just stared at him, the words echoing in her mind. Never again. It seemed impossible. Her father was the captain of the Tide Runner. That was not just his job. It was who he was. The ferry was his life, his purpose. To take that away from him, it was like taking the sea away from a fish. It was a kind of death. Tessa did not cry. The shock was too deep for tears. She felt a strange numbness spread through her, a cold, empty feeling. She asked if she could see him. The doctor nodded and led her down a long, quiet corridor to a room in the intensive care unit. Her father was in a bed, looking small and lost amidst the medical equipment. He was sleeping, his breathing even. The steady beep of the monitor was a comforting presence in the quiet room. Tessa pulled a chair up to the side of his bed and sat down. She reached out and took his hand. It felt cool and limp in hers. She sat there for a long time, just watching him breathe, her mind a blank, unable to think about the future, unable to think about what this meant for him, for her, for their family. Later that night, after making the difficult phone call to her mother, Tessa was allowed to use a small private room at the hospital to get some sleep. But sleep would not come. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the dark ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about the ferry, the Tide Runner, docked and dark at the mainland harbor. Without a captain, it was just a piece of metal, a useless hulk. And without the ferry, her family had no income. The thought of money felt trivial and wrong at a time like this, but it was a cold, hard reality that she could not ignore. The ferry was their only source of support. It paid for their home, for their food, for everything. A few days passed in a blur of hospital corridors and quiet waiting rooms. Her father's condition was stable, but he was weak and slept most of the time. Her mother had managed to get a ride on a fisherman's boat to the mainland, and her presence was a quiet comfort, but it was also a source of shared anxiety. They both knew what this meant for their future, and the unspoken fear hung in the air between them. One afternoon, while Tessa was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, forcing herself to eat a tasteless sandwich, a man in a sharp suit approached her table. He was older, with a cold, professional smile that did not reach his eyes. He introduced himself as a representative from a large mainland shipping company. He said he had heard about her father's unfortunate situation, and he wanted to express his company's sympathy. Then he got to the real reason for his visit. He explained that his company was looking to expand its services. He said that the Sea Light Island ferry route was a small but potentially profitable one. He made them an offer. His company would buy the route from her family. They would buy the Tide Runner for a price that seemed shockingly low. He presented it as a helpful solution to their problems, a way for them to get some quick money and relieve themselves of the burden of the ferry. Tessa listened to him, a slow, cold anger beginning to build inside her. This man did not see a family tragedy. He saw a business opportunity. He saw their vulnerability as a chance to profit. She looked at his polished shoes and his expensive watch, and she thought of her father's calloused hands and the faded paint of the Tide Runner. He was trying to buy their life, their history, and he was offering them almost nothing for it. He told her to think about it, that the offer was only on the table for a short time. He left his business card on the table and walked away, leaving Tessa feeling small and powerless. That night, she could not stay in the hospital. The air felt suffocating. She needed to be near the sea. She walked down to the harbor, the cool night air a welcome relief. She stood on the dock looking at the Tide Runner. The ferry was dark and silent, a ghost of its usual self. It looked sad, abandoned. This boat was her father's legacy. It was her legacy too. It was the heart of her community. To sell it to a faceless company, to let them turn it into just another line on a profit sheet, it felt like a betrayal. She thought about the man in the suit. She thought about his cold smile and his easy offer. The world was a much harder, colder place than she had ever imagined. On her small island, people helped each other. They looked out for one another. Here, in this larger world, it seemed that people were just waiting for you to stumble so they could take what you had. A fierce, protective instinct rose up in her. She would not let that happen. She would not let them take this from her family. But what could she do? The reality was harsh. They needed money. They could not run the ferry without a captain. The problem seemed impossible, a solid wall with no way around it. She stood there for a long time, the rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the dock a familiar, calming presence. She looked up at the night sky. It was clear now, and the stars were bright. She thought about the old stories of sailors navigating by those stars, finding their way across vast, dark oceans. They had to be brave, they had to be smart, and they had to be willing to set a course into the unknown. And then, an idea began to form in her mind. It was a wild, audacious idea. It was a huge, terrifying gamble. It was so bold that it almost made her laugh. But the more she thought about it, the more it felt right. It felt like the only way forward. It was a path through the storm. She walked back to the hospital, her steps firm and purposeful. She went to her father's room. He was awake, his eyes open, though he still looked very tired. Her mother was asleep in the chair beside his bed. Tessa sat down on the other side. "Dad," she said softly, so as not to wake her mother. He turned his head slowly to look at her. "I'm not going to sell the ferry," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not going to let them have it." Her father just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice a weak whisper. Tessa took a deep breath. "I'm going to get my captain's license," she said. "I'm going to use our savings, and I'm going to go to the Maritime Academy in Port Blossom, and I'm going to learn how to be a captain. And then I'm going to come back and run the Tide Runner myself." For a long moment, her father just stared at her. She could see a flicker of something in his eyes, a mixture of pride and fear. He knew what a difficult path she was choosing. The academy was expensive, it was demanding, and it was a world dominated by men from powerful shipping families. She would be an outsider, a ferry girl, with no connections and no experience on the open ocean. "Tessa," he began, his voice full of concern, "it's too much. It's not your burden to carry." "It's not a burden," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. "It's our family. It's our home. This is what I have to do." Her mother stirred in her chair, woken by their quiet voices. Tessa explained her plan to her. She saw the same fear in her mother's eyes, the same worry for her daughter. But she also saw a spark of hope. It was a desperate plan, a long shot, but it was a plan. It was better than the slow, quiet despair of giving up. So the decision was made. It was an adventurous choice, a journey into a world she knew nothing about. It was a course charted not on a paper map, but on the fragile hope of a desperate heart. A few days later, after her father was moved out of intensive care and was clearly on the long road to recovery, Tessa began to make the arrangements. She withdrew the family's savings, a modest amount that had been carefully put away over many years. It was almost exactly the amount she would need for the first year of tuition at the academy. It left them with almost nothing. It was a true gamble, an all-or-nothing bet on herself. She filled out the application forms, her hand steady as she wrote her name. She said her goodbyes to her parents at the hospital. Her father gave her a small, worn compass from his pocket. It was the one he had used for years. "So you don't lose your way," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tessa held the compass tightly in her hand. It felt solid and real, a connection to him, to her home, to the life she was fighting to save. She took a bus to the sprawling, noisy city of Port Blossom, her few belongings packed in a single bag. As the bus pulled away, she looked back at the small mainland town, at the hospital where her father was recovering, at the harbor where their ferry sat silent. She was leaving it all behind. She was sailing into the unknown, on a course she had set for herself. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but stronger than the fear was a new and unfamiliar feeling, a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a deckhand, following her father's lead. She was on her own, and she was going to become a captain. Chapter 4. The Saltwater City. The bus that carried Tessa away from the quiet coastal town was a world of its own. It smelled of stale air and disinfectant. The seats were covered in a rough, patterned fabric that was scratchy against her skin. She sat by a large window, her small bag on the seat beside her, her father's compass a solid, heavy weight in her pocket. For the first hour, the landscape outside the window was familiar. The road followed the coastline, and she could see the gray-blue water of the sea, the rocky shores, and the small fishing villages nestled in sheltered coves. It was a world she understood. But then the bus turned inland, and the sea disappeared. The road became wider, a smooth black river of asphalt that cut through rolling green hills and patches of dark forest. The world became a blur of motion, of trees and fields and small, quiet towns that all looked the same. Tessa felt a growing sense of disconnection, as if a thread that had tied her to her home was being stretched thinner and thinner with every mile. As the hours passed, the landscape began to change again. The green hills gave way to flat, open land, and in the distance, she could see the first signs of the city. At first, it was just a hazy smudge on the horizon, a gray stain against the sky. But it grew larger and more solid with alarming speed. Houses began to appear, clustered together in neat rows, their roofs all the same color. Then came larger buildings, warehouses and factories with tall smokestacks. The road became wider still, splitting into multiple lanes filled with cars and trucks that moved with a relentless, roaring energy. The quiet hum of the bus was swallowed by the much larger noise of the city. Tessa had been to the mainland town many times, but it was a quiet, sleepy place compared to this. This was something else entirely. This was a place of overwhelming scale and power. The bus finally entered the city itself, and Tessa felt a tightness in her chest. The buildings were unimaginably tall, great towers of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the sky. They blocked out the sun, casting long, dark shadows over the streets below. The streets were canyons, filled with a river of traffic that flowed with a constant, angry noise of horns and engines. And there were people everywhere, thousands of them. They moved in dense crowds along the sidewalks, their faces a blur of unfamiliarity. No one looked at her. No one seemed to notice she was there. In her entire life on Sea Light Island, she had never felt so completely and utterly invisible. The bus station was even worse. It was a vast, cavernous space, its high ceiling echoing with a chaotic symphony of sounds. The screech of brakes, the rumble of engines, the distorted voices coming from loudspeakers, and the constant shuffling murmur of the crowd. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and fast food. Tessa clutched her bag tightly, feeling small and lost. She had a map, a piece of paper that her mother had printed for her, with a red line drawn from the bus station to the small room she had rented. On the paper, it looked simple, a straight line and a few turns. But in the reality of the city, it was a terrifying puzzle. She stepped out of the station and onto the street, and the full force of the city hit her. The noise was a physical thing, a pressure against her ears. The sheer number of people moving around her was dizzying. She stood for a long moment, completely overwhelmed, the map trembling in her hand. Everyone else seemed to know exactly where they were going. They moved with purpose, their faces set, their pace quick. Tessa felt like a small stone in a powerful river, in danger of being swept away. She took a deep breath, the city air tasting of exhaust and damp concrete. She looked at her map, then at the street signs, trying to match the names. She began to walk, her steps uncertain. She kept her head down, trying to make herself as small as possible. The city was a sensory assault. Bright advertisements flashed from giant screens on the sides of buildings. Music blared from open doorways. The smells changed with every step. The sweet scent of roasting nuts from a street cart, the sour smell of garbage from an alleyway, the sudden, pleasant aroma of baking bread from a small bakery. It was too much, too fast. She felt a wave of longing for the simple, clean smells of her island. The salt of the sea, the green scent of the grass, the wood smoke from the cottage chimneys. After getting lost twice and having to ask for directions from a man who barely glanced at her before pointing and walking away, she finally found the street where she was supposed to be staying. It was a narrow side street, quieter than the main roads, lined with tall old brick buildings. Her room was on the third floor of one of these buildings. The staircase was dark and narrow, and the air smelled of dust and old cooking. The room itself was small, smaller even than her room at home. There was a narrow bed, a small scarred wooden desk, and a single window that looked out onto a solid brick wall just a few feet away. There was no view of the sky, no glimpse of the sea. It was a small, plain box. Tessa put her bag on the bed and sat down. The springs of the old mattress creaked loudly in the quiet room. She was finally alone, away from the crowds and the noise. But the silence was not the peaceful silence of her island. It was an empty, lonely silence. The city was still there, a constant low hum that vibrated through the floor and the walls. It was the sound of a million lives being lived all around her, lives that had nothing to do with her. She felt a profound and aching loneliness. She was a stranger here, an outsider. She pulled her father's compass from her pocket. She held it in her hand, its cool, smooth brass a comforting weight. She opened the lid. The needle trembled for a moment and then settled, pointing north. It was a small piece of certainty in this confusing, overwhelming place. It was a link to her father, to her home. It was a reminder of why she was here. She was not here to be comfortable. She was here to fight for them. The thought gave her a small measure of strength. She lay down on the bed, fully clothed, and closed her eyes. But the city did not go away. It was there, a restless, breathing giant just outside her window. The next morning, she walked to the Maritime Academy. The campus was located near the port, and as she got closer, the air began to smell of salt and diesel again, a familiar scent that gave her a small bit of comfort. The academy itself was not a single building, but a collection of them, set on a large piece of land that was surrounded by a high black iron fence. The buildings were old and impressive, made of dark red brick and gray stone. They had tall, arched windows and heavy wooden doors. The main building had a clock tower that rose high into the air, its face looking out toward the sea. The whole place radiated a sense of history, of tradition, of seriousness. It was intimidating. It felt like a place where important things happened, a place for important people. Tessa felt a renewed sense of being an outsider. Her simple clothes and worn boots felt out of place in front of these grand, imposing buildings. She took a deep breath and walked through the main gate. The grounds were neat and orderly, with manicured lawns and stone pathways. Young men, most of them about her age, were walking between the buildings, carrying books. They walked with an easy confidence, laughing and talking with each other. They looked like they belonged here. They looked like they had been born to walk these paths. The orientation for new students was held in a large hall with a high vaulted ceiling and dark wood paneling on the walls. The room was filled with the low hum of conversation. Tessa found an empty seat near the back, hoping to remain unnoticed. She looked around at the other students. They were almost all young men, and they were dressed in expensive casual clothes. Many of them seemed to know each other, clapping each other on the back, falling into easy, familiar groups. Tessa saw one young man who seemed to be the center of one of the largest groups. He was tall and handsome, with dark hair and a smile that was both charming and arrogant. He wore a crisp, clean shirt and carried himself with an air of effortless superiority, as if the world was a place that had been created for his convenience. He seemed to notice Tessa looking at him. His eyes met hers for a brief moment. He looked her up and down, taking in her simple sweater and her practical boots. His smile tightened slightly at the corners, a flicker of amusement, of dismissal. Then he turned away, back to his friends, as if she were not worth a second glance. In that single brief look, Tessa felt she had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. She felt a flush of shame and anger. She did not know who he was, but she already disliked him intensely. A man walked onto the stage at the front of the hall, and a hush fell over the room. He was an older man, not tall, but with a solid, powerful presence. His face was weathered, carved with deep lines, the skin tanned from a lifetime of sun and wind. His hair was short and gray, and his eyes were a pale, piercing blue. He wore the simple, dark uniform of an instructor, but he stood with the unshakable stillness of a captain on the bridge of his ship. This, she knew from the welcome packet, was Mr. Cormac, the head instructor of the academy. He did not smile. He simply looked out at the sea of new faces before him, his gaze sweeping across the room. His eyes seemed to miss nothing. He began to speak, his voice not loud, but deep and gravelly, with a rough edge to it, like the sound of stones being rolled by the tide. His voice commanded attention. He did not welcome them in the usual way. He did not speak of the grand traditions of the academy or the bright futures that awaited them. He spoke about the sea. He told them that the sea was not their friend. It was not their enemy. It was a vast, powerful, and indifferent force of nature. He said that the sea did not care about their family names, their wealth, or their ambitions. The sea, he said, only respected skill, discipline, and knowledge. He told them that the academy would be hard. It would push them to their limits and beyond. He said that many of them would fail. He said that was a good thing, because it was better to fail here in the classroom than to fail out there on the water where the cost of failure was measured in lives. As he spoke, Tessa felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. His words were harsh, but they were true. They were real. This was a language she understood. This man was not like the cold, smiling businessman who had tried to buy her family's life. This was a man of the sea. His words were a challenge, but they were a fair challenge. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance here. Maybe skill and discipline were things she could learn, things she could prove. After the speech, the students were dismissed to find their first classes. Tessa looked at the piece of paper in her hand. Her first class was navigation theory. She found the right classroom. It was a large room with a steeply sloped floor, like a small theater. The chairs were arranged in long curved rows, all facing a large blackboard at the front. Tessa chose a seat in the middle, not too close to the front, but not hiding in the back either. The room quickly filled up. The arrogant young man she had seen earlier came in with his friends and took a seat in the front row. He was still talking and laughing, completely at ease. The instructor came in, a thin, serious man with glasses. He began the lesson immediately, and Tessa's small flicker of hope began to die. The instructor started writing on the blackboard. He covered it in numbers and strange symbols, in long, complex equations. He spoke of things like spherical trigonometry, celestial mechanics, and azimuth calculations. The words were a foreign language to her. She had learned navigation from her father, by sight, by feel, by a deep, instinctual understanding of the water and the coastline. She knew how to read a chart, how to use a compass. But this was something else entirely. This was the abstract science behind it all, a world of pure mathematics. She tried to follow along, tried to write down the notes like the other students, but her mind could not make sense of it. The numbers and symbols on the page were just a meaningless jumble. She felt a familiar, sinking feeling of panic, the same feeling she used to get in math class in her small island school. The instructor asked a question, a long, complicated question about calculating a theoretical position based on star sightings. The room was silent for a moment. Then, the arrogant young man in the front row raised his hand. The instructor called on him. "Julian," he said. The young man, Julian, stood up and answered the question with a smooth, easy confidence. His answer was long and detailed, full of the same technical terms the instructor had been using. The instructor nodded, impressed. "Excellent, Mr. Croft," he said. Croft. The name of the large shipping company that had tried to buy their route was Croft Maritime. This was Julian Croft, the son of the man whose company was trying to ruin her family. The realization hit Tessa with the force of a physical blow. Her antagonist now had a name and a face, and he was sitting in the front row, effortlessly succeeding where she was completely and utterly failing. The rest of the day was no better. In her maritime law class, she was faced with thick textbooks filled with dense, legal language that was almost impossible to understand. In engineering principles, the instructor talked about thermodynamics and fluid dynamics, concepts that were completely alien to her. Tessa, who could diagnose a problem with the Tide Runner's engine just by the sound it made, could not understand the complex diagrams and formulas on the page. She felt a growing sense of despair. She was a fraud. She did not belong here. She had made a terrible, foolish mistake. She had taken her family's life savings, their only hope, and she was going to waste it. At the end of the day, she walked back to her small, lonely room, the weight of her failure pressing down on her. The city seemed louder and more menacing than before. She felt Julian Croft's dismissive gaze on her back. She could almost hear him laughing at the stupid ferry girl who thought she could become a captain. She spent that evening, and many evenings after, in the Academy's library. It was a vast, silent room with shelves that reached all the way to the high ceiling, filled with thousands of books. She sat at a small wooden desk, surrounded by stacks of textbooks, trying to force the knowledge into her head. She read the same pages over and over, the words blurring in front of her tired eyes. The numbers and formulas swam before her, refusing to make sense. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of information she could not understand. Her isolation was complete. The other students formed study groups, working together to solve the difficult problems. They would gather at tables in the library, their heads bent together, their low voices a murmur of shared understanding. Tessa was always alone. No one invited her to join them. She was the quiet girl from the island, the one who never knew the answers in class. She was invisible. Julian Croft and his friends would sometimes be in the library, and she would watch them from a distance. They never seemed to struggle. They would finish their work quickly and then leave, their laughter echoing in the quiet halls. They were from a different world, a world of privilege and easy success. Tessa felt a bitter resentment toward them, but she also felt a deep and painful sense of her own inadequacy. The only moments of relief came in the practical lessons. Once a week, they had a class on practical seamanship taught by Mr. Cormack himself. These classes were held not in a classroom, but in a large workshop near the docks, a place that smelled of rope and tar and old wood. Here, Tessa was in her element. When they were taught how to splice a rope, her hands, so clumsy with a pen, moved with a fluid, confident grace. She could do it perfectly on the first try, her fingers weaving the strands together with a speed and precision that came from years of practice. When they were taught a series of complex knots, the kind used on large sailing ships, she already knew them all. Her father had taught them to her when she was a little girl, treating it as a game. Mr. Cormack noticed. He would walk through the workshop, his sharp eyes watching everyone. He did not offer praise easily, but one afternoon, as Tessa was showing another struggling student how to tie a particularly difficult knot. He stopped and watched her. He did not say a word. He just watched her hands, his expression unreadable. When she was done, he gave a single sharp nod of approval before moving on. It was a small gesture, but for Tessa, it was a lifeline. It was the first time since she had arrived that anyone had acknowledged that she had any skill at all. It was a confirmation that her past, her life on the ferry with her father, was not worthless. It had value. Julian Croft saw it too. He was struggling with the same knot, his smooth, clean hands clumsy and slow. He saw Mr. Cormac's nod to Tessa, and his handsome face tightened with annoyance. He looked at Tessa, his eyes filled with a new kind of contempt. It was no longer just dismissal. It was a resentful dislike. He muttered something to his friend, just loud enough for Tessa to hear. "Show off! It's all a fairy girl is good for." The words were a small, sharp sting, but they were also fuel. The anger and the injustice of it all hardened into a cold, fierce resolve. She would not let him win. She would not let this place break her. She would work harder. She would stay later. She would prove to him, to everyone, and most of all to herself, that she was more than just a fairy girl. She was the daughter of a captain, and she would become a captain too. Chapter 5. Learning the Stars. The days at the Maritime Academy settled into a hard, grueling routine. Tessa's life became a simple, repeating pattern of classroom, library, and her small, lonely room. She woke before the sun, the faint city glow a pale imitation of the dawn she was used to. She would sit at her small desk, a single lamp pushing back the darkness, and read until her eyes burned. She would review the notes from the day before, trying to force the complex theories and mathematical formulas to stay in her head. It felt like trying to build a stone wall with handfuls of dry sand. The information just slipped through her mind, leaving behind only a frustrating residue of confusion. In the classroom, she remained silent. She never raised her hand to answer a question, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of drawing the attention of Julian Croft and his friends, afraid of revealing the true depth of her ignorance. She listened intently, her pen scratching across the pages of her notebook, trying to capture every word, every diagram, hoping that if she wrote it all down, it would somehow, magically, begin to make sense. She felt a constant, low-level anxiety, a knot in her stomach that tightened whenever an instructor asked a question she could not answer. Her small victories in Mr. Cormac's practical seamanship class were a double-edged sword. They gave her a much-needed taste of competence, but they also made her a target. Julian Croft, who continued to be clumsy and slow with the physical tasks of a sailor, seemed to have decided that Tessa was his personal rival. He found small, cruel ways to remind her of her place. He would make comments, just loud enough for her to hear, about how some people were good with their hands because they were not good with their minds. He would accidentally bump into her in the crowded hallways, sending her books scattering across the floor. They were small, childish acts of malice, but they had their intended effect. They made her feel even more isolated, even more like she did not belong. She did not react. She would simply pick up her books, her face a blank mask, and walk away. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her anger or her hurt. She channeled all of that emotion, all of that frustration, into her work. The library became her true home, her sanctuary, and her battlefield. She was relentless. She was the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave at night. The librarians began to recognize her, giving her a small, sympathetic smile as she checked out yet another stack of books. She discovered that if she broke the huge, complex subjects down into their smallest possible parts, she could begin to understand them. She would take a single equation from her navigation class and spend an entire evening on it, looking up the meaning of each symbol, reading about the history of its discovery, finding simpler examples in older, more basic textbooks. It was a slow, painstaking process. It was like trying to learn a new language one word at a time. But slowly, very slowly, it began to work. A few of the abstract concepts started to become a little less blurry. She started to see the faint outlines of the logic that held them together. She formed a tentative friendship with another student, a quiet, serious young man named Ben. Ben was not from a wealthy shipping family. His father was a mechanic who worked on fishing boats in a small town down the coast. Like Tessa, Ben was an outsider. He was not a target of Julian's cruelty, but he was largely ignored by the popular, confident crowd. Ben was good at the academic work, but struggled with the practical lessons. He was intelligent, but not a natural sailor. They began to help each other. In the evenings, they would find a quiet corner of the library. Ben would patiently explain the difficult concepts of engineering to Tessa, drawing simple diagrams to illustrate his points. In return, in the workshop, Tessa would show him the proper way to coil a rope or the fastest way to tie a bowline knot. They rarely spoke about their personal lives. Their friendship was built on a foundation of shared struggle and mutual respect. It was a small, quiet connection, but for Tessa, it was a lifeline in her sea of loneliness. One afternoon, they had a class in the ship simulator. This was a class that everyone was excited about. The simulator was in a large, dark room. In the center of the room was a perfect replica of the bridge of a modern cargo ship. There was a captain's chair, a large wheel, and an array of complex control panels filled with screens, buttons, and levers. The windows of the bridge were actually massive, high-definition screens that could project a completely realistic 360-degree view of the sea. The whole room was on a hydraulic platform that could move and tilt, perfectly mimicking the motion of a ship on the water. It was the closest they could get to being on a real ship without leaving the campus. The lesson for the day was storm navigation. Mr. Cormack was the instructor. He stood in the corner of the dark room, a silent, observant presence. The students were to take turns at the helm, each one guiding the simulated ship through a sudden, violent storm. It was a test of everything they had been learning. Julian Croft, of course, was the first to volunteer. He strode to the captain's chair with his usual arrogance. He looked completely comfortable, his hands moving surely over the controls. Mr. Cormack gave the signal, and the simulation began. The calm, sunny day projected on the screens around them quickly darkened. The sea, which had been a flat blue plain, began to churn. The platform beneath them began to roll and pitch. The the sound of wind and rain filled the room. Julian was a model student. He followed the procedures from the textbook perfectly. He gave calm, precise orders to the other students who were playing the role of his crew. He kept the ship headed directly into the waves, the standard procedure for maintaining control in a storm. He was doing everything by the book, but the storm in the simulation was designed to be unpredictable. A rogue wave, much larger than the others, suddenly appeared on the screen, a massive wall of water bearing down on them from a slightly different angle. The textbook procedure was to hold the course. But Tessa, watching from the side, felt a jolt of recognition. The situation was almost identical to the one she had faced with her father on the Tide Runner. She remembered how her father had not held the course, how he had made a small, sharp turn to meet the wave at a slightly different angle, a more stable one. Julian did not make that turn. He held his course just as the textbook said. The simulated wave crashed over the bow of the ship. The platform lurched violently, and a loud, blaring alarm sounded, indicating that the ship had taken on a dangerous amount of water. The screens flashed red with the words, "Simulation failed." Julian stood there for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. He had done everything right. He had followed all the rules, but he had failed. Mr. Cormac's rough voice cut through the silence. "The book gives you the rules, Mr. Croft," he said, his tone flat and unimpressed. "The sea does not always follow the rules." Then he looked around the room. "Next," he said. No one volunteered. The other students were intimidated by Julian's failure. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Tessa heard a voice say, "I'll go." She was surprised to realize it was her own. She had spoken without thinking, her instinct taking over. All eyes in the room turned to her. She could feel Julian's glare, hot with resentment. She walked to the captain's chair, her heart pounding. The simulator was reset. The storm began again, the same sequence of events. The sea churned, the wind howled. The platform rolled beneath her feet, a familiar and strangely comforting motion. Tessa did not think about the textbook. She thought about her father. She thought about the feel of the Tide Runner in a storm. She did not focus on the complex digital readouts on the screens. She focused on the waves, on their rhythm, on their power. She could almost feel the sea, even though she knew it was not real. When the rogue wave appeared, she did not hesitate. She made the same small, sharp turn her father had made. It was an unconventional move, a decision based on experience and instinct, not on a rule written in a book. The simulated ship met the wave at a better angle. It rose up and over the crest, the platform tilting steeply, but without the violent, jarring crash of Julian's attempt. The ship took on some water, but not a dangerous amount. The alarms remained silent. She guided the ship through the rest of the storm, her hands steady on the wheel, her commands to her crew quiet and clear. When the simulation ended and the calm, sunny day returned to the screens, the room was silent. She had not been perfect. Her run had been less polished than Julian's, but she had succeeded where he had failed. Mr. Cormac said nothing for a long moment. He just looked at her, his pale blue eyes seeming to see right through her. Then He gave another one of his small, sharp nods. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of quiet respect. In that moment, Tessa felt a surge of pride that was so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. She had done it. She had proven that her knowledge, the knowledge she had gained on her father's ferry, had real value. It was a different kind of knowledge than the kind found in books, but it was just as important. The other students looked at her with a new, surprised respect. All except for Julian. His face was dark with a cold, pure fury. She had not just succeeded, she had publicly humiliated him. His dislike of her was now cemented into a deep and bitter hatred. The simulator experience was a turning point for Tessa. It gave her a new confidence. It did not make the academic work any easier, but it changed her attitude toward it. She began to see the books and the equations not as an impossible wall, but as a set of tools. They were another way of understanding the sea she already knew so well. She began to connect the abstract theories to her own real-world experiences. When an instructor talked about the principles of hydrodynamics, she thought about the way the water flowed around the hull of the tide runner. When they studied weather patterns, she thought about the clouds over Sea Light Island and the way the wind felt on her face. The academic work was still a struggle, but it was no longer a meaningless one. It now had a context, a purpose, and as her understanding grew, so did her grades. She was still not at the top of the class, like Julian, but she was no longer at the bottom. She was passing. She was surviving. She also began to receive letters from home. Her father was slowly recovering. He was out of the hospital now, but he was not the same. His letters were written in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. At first, they were full of practical advice for her studies, small tips about navigation or engine maintenance. But as the weeks went by, the tone of the letters began to change. He wrote about how quiet the island was without the ferry. He wrote about how he spent his days sitting on the porch, watching the empty water. He wrote about how much he missed the feel of the boat under his feet. Tessa could read the deep sadness and sense of loss between the lines. He did not say it directly, but she knew he felt useless, adrift. But he also wrote about how proud he was of her. He told her that her letters, in which she described her small successes at the academy, were the brightest part of his day. He told her that she was his hope. These letters became Tessa's most precious possession. She would read them over and over again in her small, plain room. They were a powerful reminder of what she was fighting for. She was not just fighting for a license. She was fighting for her father's spirit. She was fighting to give him back his world. His pride in her became the fuel that drove her through the long nights of study, through the exhaustion, through the loneliness. The tension with Julian Croft continued to grow. Her success in the simulator had made him more determined than ever to see her fail. He could no longer dismiss her as an ignorant ferry girl. He now saw her as a threat, however small. He and his friends would create a tight, exclusive circle in the hallways, forcing her to walk around them. They would fall silent whenever she entered a room, making her feel like an intruder. It was a constant, draining psychological pressure. Tessa did her best to ignore it. She focused on her work, on her letters from her father, and on her quiet friendship with Ben. She was learning more than just navigation and engineering at the academy. She was learning how to be resilient. She was learning how to endure. She was learning how to stand alone in a hostile world and not be broken by it. One evening, she was in the library working on a complex chart plotting problem. It was a difficult assignment, and she had been struggling with it for hours. She was tired, and her head ached. She felt a familiar wave of frustration and self-doubt. She was about to give up for the night when she remembered a small trick her father had taught her, a simple way of double-checking a position by using landmarks on the shore. It was not a method that was in any of their modern textbooks. It was an old sailor's trick. On an impulse, she tried it on her chart. She used the headlands and the small islands on the map as her landmarks, just as she would have done on the tide runner. And suddenly, the problem became clear. The numbers and lines on the chart clicked into place. She had found the solution, a simple, elegant solution that had been hidden in the complexity of the official methods. She felt a quiet thrill of discovery. She had not just solved a problem. She had built a bridge between the two worlds of her knowledge, the old practical world of her father and the new theoretical world of the academy. In that moment, she knew with a deep and quiet certainty that she was going to make it. It would be hard. It would be lonely. But she had found her course. She was learning to navigate not just by the stars in the sky, but by the stars that she carried within herself. Chapter 6. A Lighthouse in the Fog. The academy granted a short break between terms. It was only a few days, a brief pause in the relentless schedule of classes and exams. Most students used the time to relax, to go out and enjoy the city, or to visit their wealthy families in their comfortable homes. For Tessa, it was a precious opportunity. It was a chance to go home. The journey back to Sea Light Island was the reverse of the one that had brought her to the city. She took a bus from the loud, chaotic city station back to the quiet mainland town that bordered the sea. With every mile that passed, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The tall buildings gave way to open fields, and the thick, heavy city air was replaced by a cleaner, fresher breeze that smelled of grass and damp earth. When she finally saw the sea again, a familiar, deep ache of longing in her chest eased. The sight of the water, vast and gray under an overcast sky, was like the face of an old, dear friend. But the journey was not complete. The final leg, the short crossing to the island, was now a problem. The tide runner was still docked and silent. There was no regular ferry service. Her mother had arranged for her to get a ride with Finn, the young fisherman. Tessa met him at the commercial dock, a different place from the familiar ferry terminal. Finn's boat was small and smelled strongly of fish and salt and diesel. It was a practical, hard-working boat, its deck cluttered with nets and ropes and plastic bins. Finn greeted her with a quiet, shy smile. They had known each other their whole lives, but they had never been close friends. They were just two people who shared the same small island, their lives running in parallel, like two different currents in the same sea. The crossing was rough, the water was choppy, and the small fishing boat slapped against the waves, sending a cold spray over the deck. It was a very different feeling from the steady, solid presence of the tide runner. This small boat felt vulnerable, a tiny speck on the vast, indifferent water. As Sea Light Island came into view, a familiar shape on the horizon, Tessa felt a surge of emotion so strong it almost took her breath away. This was home. The sight of the green hills, the old stone lighthouse, the small cluster of houses around the harbor, it was a part of her soul. But as they got closer, she began to notice a change. The island looked the same, but it felt different. There was a stillness about it, a quietness that was not peaceful. It was a sad, listless quiet. The harbor, which was usually a place of gentle activity, was almost empty. A few small boats were tied to the docks, but there was no movement, no sign of life. When they docked, there was no one there to meet them. The village was strangely silent. The general store was open, but there were no customers inside. The few people she saw on the street gave her a small, sad wave, but they did not stop to talk. A kind of gloom, a subtle fog of worry and resignation, seemed to have settled over the entire island. Without the ferry, the island's lifeline had been cut. Getting supplies was difficult. Traveling to the mainland for work or for a doctor's appointment was a complicated and expensive ordeal. The island was slowly withering, its connection to the outside world severed. Tessa felt a heavy weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had known in an abstract way that her mission was important for the island. But now, seeing it with her own eyes, she felt the true weight of their hope. It was a heavy burden. Her cottage was just as she remembered it, the familiar smell of wood smoke and old books, a welcome comfort. Her mother greeted her with a hug that was fierce and tight, a hug that spoke of months of worry and loneliness. Her mother had aged. There were new lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She had been carrying the weight of her husband's illness and the island's troubles all by herself. Tessa's heart ached for her. And then she saw her father. He was sitting on the small front porch in his favorite old wooden chair. He was just sitting there, staring out at the empty expanse of water where the ferry should have been. He looked smaller than she remembered. The strength and vitality that had always seemed to radiate from him was gone. He was still a big man, but he seemed to have shrunk, to have faded, like an old photograph left out in the sun. He turned his head as she approached, and a slow smile spread across his face. It was a genuine smile, full of love and pride. But his eyes were sad. They were the eyes of a captain who had lost his ship, of a man who had lost his purpose. They spent the afternoon talking, Tessa telling them about the academy, about her classes, about the ship simulator. She focused on her small successes, on the positive things, trying to bring a spark of hope into the quiet, sad house. Her father listened intently, his eyes lighting up when she spoke of the practical lessons, of the things he had taught her. He would ask her sharp, technical questions, his old captain's mind still very much alive. In those moments, she could see a glimpse of the man he used to be. But then the moment would pass, and the sadness would return to his eyes, a shadow that seemed to have taken up permanent residence there. That evening, after her mother had gone to bed, Tessa sat with her father on the porch. The night was cool and quiet. The only sounds the gentle wash of the waves on the distant shore and the cry of a lone seabird. For a long time, they sat in a comfortable silence, a silence they had shared many times in the wheelhouse of the tide runner. Then her father spoke, his voice low and rough with emotion. He told her that he was afraid. He was afraid that he had pushed her into this, that he had burdened her with his own broken dream. He said that some days he wished she had just sold the ferry, that she had taken the money and made a different, easier life for herself, away from the sea, away from all of this. It was a moment of raw, painful honesty. He was confessing his deepest fears, his feeling of helplessness. He was no longer the strong, unshakable captain. He was a man who was lost, adrift in a sea of grief and regret. Tessa did not know what to say. She just reached out and put her hand on his arm. His arm was thin, the powerful muscles she remembered now soft and slack. "It's not a burden, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's my choice. It's what I want to do." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. He seemed to find what he was looking for, a strength, a resolve that he recognized, because he gave a small, slow nod. "You are a better sailor than I ever was," he said, his voice thick. It was the highest praise he could give, and it filled Tessa with a warmth that pushed back the cold night air. The next few days on the island were a strange mixture of peace and sadness. Tessa walked the familiar paths, the green hills and the rocky shores of her childhood. She breathed the clean, salt air, and she felt a sense of belonging, a deep connection to this small piece of land. But everywhere she went, she was reminded of what had been lost. She saw the worry on the faces of her neighbors. She saw the quiet desperation in the way they looked out at the empty sea. The island was a ship that had lost its engine, and it was slowly, inexorably drifting. Her visit was too short. Before she knew it, it was time to go back. The return journey with Finn felt even more somber than the arrival. As the island shrank behind them, becoming a small, lonely shape in the distance, Tessa felt a renewed sense of purpose that was so fierce it was almost painful. Her journey was no longer just about saving her family's legacy. It was about saving her home. It was about becoming a lighthouse in the fog for her entire community. She returned to the academy with a fire in her belly. The city was still loud and overwhelming. Her room was still small and lonely. And Julian Croft was still arrogant and cruel. But none of it seemed to matter as much as it had before. She had a new clarity, a new focus. Her struggles at the academy were not just personal anymore. They were part of a larger fight. This new fire did not go unnoticed. In her classes, she was no longer completely silent. She began to ask questions, thoughtful questions that showed she was not just memorizing information, but truly trying to understand it. She started to participate in the classroom discussions, her voice quiet, but her arguments clear and logical. She was still not a brilliant academic student like Julian, but she was no longer an invisible one. She was a serious, dedicated student who was earning the respect of her instructors and her more open-minded classmates. Her friendship with Ben deepened. They spent more time together, not just studying, but also just talking, sharing their hopes and their fears. She learned that he was working 2 part-time jobs to be able to afford the academy, and that he was sending money home to his family every week. He, too, was carrying the weight of his family's hopes on his shoulders. This shared burden created a strong, unspoken bond between them. The final exams for the term were approaching, and the pressure at the academy intensified. The most important exam was a complex navigation problem. It was a notoriously difficult test that required students to synthesize everything they had learned about chart plotting, tide calculations, and celestial navigation. The problem involved plotting a safe course for a large ship through a dangerous channel, with strong currents, hidden rocks, and unpredictable weather. For days before the exam, the library was filled with an atmosphere of tense, frantic energy. Students were hunched over their charts, their faces tight with concentration. Tessa worked on the practice problems with a focused intensity. She filled pages of her notebook with calculations and diagrams. She was still slow, still methodical, but she was getting better. She was beginning to see the patterns, to understand the complex interplay of forces that governed a ship's movement. On the day of the exam, the classroom was silent, the only sound the scratching of pencils and the soft rustle of paper. The problem was even harder than she had expected. It was a maze of variables and potential dangers. Tessa took a deep breath and began to work. She worked slowly, carefully, checking and rechecking each calculation. She could feel the time slipping away. She saw Julian Croft, a few rows in front of her, finish early. He put his pencil down with a confident flourish and sat back in his chair, a small, smug smile on his face. Tessa ignored him. She focused on her own chart, on her own work. She was nearing the end of the problem, plotting the final leg of the course, when she hit a wall. She had 2 possible routes, and she could not see which one was safer. One route was shorter, but it passed close to a submerged reef. The other route was longer, taking the ship into deeper, safer water, but it would use more fuel and time. The official manuals and tide tables were ambiguous. There was no clear textbook answer. She was stuck. She felt a familiar wave of panic begin to rise. She looked at the clock on the wall. She only had a few minutes left. And then she remembered her father. She remembered the long, quiet hours in the wheelhouse, listening to him talk about the sea. She remembered a story he had told her about this very stretch of coast, a story he had heard from his own father, an old sailor's tale about a strange, local current that was not on any of the official charts, a current that could pull a ship onto the rocks. It was the kind of knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation, the kind of knowledge that was not written in books. It was a memory, a piece of her past. On an impulse, a leap of faith, she trusted her father's story. She plotted her course on the longer, safer route, adding a small note in the margin of her paper. Course adjusted for undocumented local current. It was a huge risk. She was citing an old story as the basis for a major navigational decision. Her instructor would probably think she was insane. She finished the exam just as the time was called, her hand shaking slightly as she handed in her paper. The next few days, waiting for the results, were agonizing. she was convinced she had failed. She had let her emotions, her memories of her father, interfere with her professional judgment. She had been foolish. When the results were posted, she walked to the bulletin board with a feeling of dread. She scanned the long list of names and grades, her eyes searching for her own. She found it. And next to her name was a grade that made her stop and stare. It was one of the highest grades in the class, higher than Julian Croft's. He had chosen the shorter, more dangerous route, the correct answer according to the textbooks. He had received a good grade, but not a top one. There was a handwritten note on the bottom of the posted results from Mr. Cormack himself. It read, "Special commendation to Cadet Tessa for the application of practical local knowledge. A captain must navigate by the charts, but must also listen to the sea." Tessa stood there, reading the words over and over again, a slow, wide smile spreading across her face. It was more than just a good grade. It was a validation of everything she was, of her past, of her father's teachings. She had not just solved a problem. She had proven that her island knowledge, the knowledge that Julian and the others looked down upon, was not a weakness. It was her greatest strength. It was the lighthouse that would guide her through the fog. Chapter 7. Captain's Weather. The final term at the academy was different. A change had occurred, subtle but significant. Tessa's unexpected success on the navigation exam had sent a quiet ripple through the student body. The open contempt from Julian Croft and his circle did not vanish, but it was now tinged with a grudging, resentful respect. They could no longer dismiss her. She had proven in a way they could not ignore that she was a serious contender. For Tessa, the change was internal. The constant, gnawing self-doubt had receded. It was replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She was still not a brilliant student in the traditional sense, but she had come to understand her own strengths. She had accepted that her path to becoming a captain was different from everyone else's, and she was no longer ashamed of it. She walked the stone paths of the academy with her head held a little higher. She still felt like an outsider, but she no longer felt like an imposter. The final test, the culmination of their year of grueling work, was not a written exam. It was a multi-day voyage on the open ocean. They would be aboard the Academy's training vessel, a small but sturdy ship named the North Star. The students would be the crew, and each one, in turn, would be required to take command, to act as captain for a leg of the journey. They would be judged not just on their technical skills, but on their ability to lead, to make decisions under pressure, to command the respect of their crew. This was the ultimate test. It was not about theory, it was about reality. The night before they were scheduled to depart, a nervous energy filled the air. Tessa packed her small bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed her father's compass on top of her clothes, its brass case cool and solid in her hand. She felt a deep sense of anticipation, a mixture of excitement and a profound, bone-deep fear. This was it. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, it all came down to this single voyage. The next morning, the students gathered at the dock where the North Star was moored. The ship was larger than the Tide Runner, sleeker and more modern, but it had the same feel of a vessel built for serious work. Its white paint was streaked with rust from its many journeys, and its deck was scuffed and worn. Mr. Cormack was there, his weathered face as grim and unreadable as ever. He stood on the deck, watching them as they came aboard, his pale eyes missing nothing. He did not give them a speech. He simply assigned them to their watches and told them to prepare to get underway. The first few hours of the voyage were calm. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze filled the sails. The ship cut cleanly through the calm blue water, leaving a trail of white foam in its wake. The students worked together, their movements a little clumsy at first, but slowly finding a rhythm. They were no longer just classmates. They were a crew. Tessa felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was where she belonged, the feel of the deck moving beneath her feet, the taste of salt on the air, the vast open expanse of the sea and the sky. This was her world. The first student to take command was a quiet, competent young man who handled his watch without any major incidents. The second was one of Julian's friends, who was a little too confident and made a few minor errors that earned him a sharp, critical look from Mr. Cormack. Then it was Julian's turn. He took the helm as if he were born to it. He stood tall and confident, his voice clear and commanding as he gave his orders. He was, Tessa had to admit, very good. He knew the procedures perfectly. His commands were precise. He had the easy authority of a person who has never known what it is like to not be in charge. The weather remained clear during his watch. He had an easy, uneventful run, and when his time was up, he handed over the command with a self-satisfied smile, as if he had already proven his superiority. The ship sailed on through the day and into the night. Tessa stood her watch, her eyes scanning the dark water, the only light the faint glow of the stars and the soft green light of the ship's instruments. The sea was different at night, a vast, mysterious, and humbling presence. It made her feel very small, but not in a bad way. It was a reminder of the power and the beauty of the world she had chosen to be a part of. The next day, the weather began to change. The clear blue sky was replaced by a high, thin layer of gray clouds. The wind picked up, and the sea, which had been so calm, began to swell. Mr. Cormack informed them that a storm system, larger and faster moving than predicted, was heading their way. He did not seem concerned. He simply said, "This will be a good test. The sea does not always keep to a schedule." As the day wore on, the storm grew closer. The sky turned a dark, angry gray, and the wind began to howl in the ship's rigging. Rain began to fall, first as a light drizzle, then as a heavy, driving sheet of water. The waves grew larger, and the North Star began to pitch and roll in the turbulent sea. It was a real storm, not a simulation. This was Captain's weather. And it was Julian Croft's turn at the helm again. He stood at the wheel, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He was determined to succeed where he had failed in the simulator. He would prove that he was the better captain. But the real sea was a very different thing from a computer program. It was wilder, more chaotic, more unpredictable. Julian was rigid. He relied too heavily on the technology, his eyes glued to the radar screen and the digital readouts. He was not looking at the waves, not feeling the rhythm of the ship. He was trying to force the ship to obey the rules in the textbook, but the sea was not cooperating. He gave a series of sharp, arrogant commands, ignoring the quiet suggestions of some of the more experienced students. He was making the ship fight the sea, and the ship was losing. The vessel was taking a terrible beating, slamming into the waves with a series of jarring, violent crashes that sent shudders through the entire hull. Below deck, equipment broke loose from its moorings, and the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor echoed through the ship. The crew, the other students, were becoming tense and anxious. They were losing confidence in their captain. Tessa was stationed as a lookout on the bow, a cold and miserable position. She was clipped to a safety line, the wind and rain lashing at her face. But from her position, she could see the sea more clearly than Julian could from the sheltered bridge. She saw the way the waves were forming, the strange crossing patterns that indicated a powerful and dangerous current. She knew, with a certainty that came from her gut, that they were in a bad position. Julian was so focused on keeping the bow pointed directly into the main swell that he was ignoring a more dangerous set of waves coming at them from the side. She keyed her headset. "Bridge, this is lookout," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the wind. "We have a strong cross-sea developing. I recommend a course correction, 10 degrees to starboard." There was a moment of silence. Then Julian's voice, tight with anger, came back over the headset. "Negative, lookout. Hold your position. I have command here." Tessa did not argue. She had done her duty. She had reported what she saw. The decision was his. A few moments later, a massive wave, one of the cross-sea waves she had warned him about, slammed into the side of the ship. The North Star was knocked sideways with a violent, sickening lurch. Tessa was thrown against the railing, her safety line pulling tight and saving her from being washed overboard. A loud crack echoed from the mast above, and one of the sails, which had not been properly secured, ripped free and began to flog wildly in the wind. Its heavy ropes and pulleys a deadly, whipping hazard. The ship was in real danger. Mr. Cormack had been watching everything, a silent, grim figure in the corner of the bridge. Now he moved. He stepped forward, his face like a thundercloud. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "you are relieved of command." Julian stared at him, his face pale with shock and humiliation. "Sir," he began to protest, but Mr. Cormack cut him off. "Now." Julian stepped away from the helm, his face a mixture of fury and shame. Mr. Cormack scanned the faces of the other students on the bridge. His eyes landed on Tessa. "Cadet," he said, his voice sharp and clear over the roar of the storm, "you have the con." Tessa's heart leaped into her throat. This was not supposed to be her turn, but it was an order. It was not a request. She unclipped her safety line and made her way carefully along the slippery deck to the bridge. She was soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face, but she felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. When she stepped onto the bridge, all eyes were on her. She could feel the fear and uncertainty of the other students. She could feel the burning hatred in Julian's stare. She ignored it all. She walked to the helm. The ship felt wrong. It was fighting itself, shuddering and groaning under the strain. She put her hands on the wheel. She closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the movement of the vessel through the soles of her boots, through the palms of her hands. She was not thinking about the textbook anymore. She was listening to the ship. She was listening to the sea. She opened her eyes. "Course correction," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that surprised even herself. 10 degrees to starboard. Ease the sheets on the mainsail. We need to secure that flogging jib. Her commands were simple, clear, and immediate. The other students, who had been frozen with uncertainty under Julian's command, now moved with a new sense of purpose. The student at the navigation station repeated her order and adjusted the ship's heading. Others scrambled to deal with the sails. There was no hesitation. They trusted her. They trusted her because she was not arrogant. She was calm. She was focused. She was a sailor. Tessa did not fight the storm. She worked with it. She made small, constant adjustments to the course, easing the ship through the waves instead of crashing into them. The violent, jarring motion of the vessel began to lessen, replaced by a long, deep, rhythmic roll. It was still a storm. It was still dangerous, but the ship was no longer in a state of crisis. It was riding the storm, not being broken by it. For what felt like hours, she stood at the helm, her body braced against the motion of the ship, her eyes constantly scanning the sea, her mind focused on 1,000 small details at once. She was not just a student anymore. She was the captain. The worst of the storm passed just as the sun was beginning to set. The wind began to ease, and the waves grew smaller. The heavy, dark clouds began to break apart, and a few stray beams of golden sunlight cut through, painting the dark, churning sea with a strange, wild beauty. The North Star had made it through. The ship was damaged, the ripped sail a testament to the violence of the storm, but the crew was safe. They were all exhausted, soaked, and cold, but they were safe. Tessa finally relinquished the helm, her arms and shoulders aching with a deep, profound weariness. As she stepped away from the wheel, her crew, her fellow students, looked at her with a new and profound respect. There were no words, just a series of quiet nods. In the shared experience of the storm, they had been forged into a true crew, and she had been their true captain. Mr. Cormack came over to her. He stood in front of her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the dim light of the bridge. Tessa braced herself for criticism, for a detailed list of all the small mistakes she had made. But Mr. Cormack did not offer criticism. He just looked at her, his pale blue eyes seeming to see into her very soul. "That was the captain's weather," he said, his rough voice quiet. "And you were the captain." And then he did something she had never seen him do before. He smiled. It was not a big smile, just a small, slight curving of his lips. But it was a genuine smile, a smile of approval, of deep and earned respect. In that moment, Tessa knew she had passed her ultimate test. She had not just learned how to be a captain, she had become one. Chapter 8. The Captain of Sea Light Island. The return journey to Port Blossom was quiet and subdued. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm, gray sea and a sky the color of washed-out linen. The students worked to tidy the ship, securing the damaged sail and coiling the wet, heavy ropes. A sense of shared exhaustion hung in the air, but it was mixed with a quiet pride. They had faced a real test, and they had survived. They were no longer just students, they were sailors. Tessa felt a profound sense of peace. The exhaustion was a deep ache in her bones, but it was a good kind of ache. It was the feeling of having done hard, important work. She stood at the railing, watching the mainland grow closer on the horizon, the city a smudge of gray against the pale sky. She was not the same person who had arrived in this city a year ago. That girl had been timid, lost, and full of doubt. This new person, this young woman who was returning, was quiet, but she was not timid. She was a captain. Julian Croft avoided her. He spent the rest of the voyage in a state of sullen silence. His public failure, followed by her public success, had shattered his arrogance. He was left with nothing but a bitter, resentful shame. Tessa felt no triumph in his defeat. She felt only a quiet, detached pity. He had all the advantages, all the knowledge from the books, but he lacked the one thing a true captain needed: a deep, humble respect for the power of the sea. When the North Star finally docked at the Academy's pier, the voyage was officially over. Their final test was complete. The students disembarked, their faces tired, but their steps a little surer than when they had left. The graduation ceremony was a few days later. It was a formal affair, held in the same grand hall where they had received their intimidating welcome from Mr. Cormack a year before. The students wore dark, formal uniforms. The air was filled with a sense of accomplishment and anticipation. Families were in attendance, their faces beaming with pride. Tessa sat alone. Her parents could not make the journey. Her father was still not strong enough, and her mother could not leave him. But she did not feel lonely. She carried them with her, in her heart. When her name was called, she walked across the stage, her steps steady and confident. Mr. Cormack handed her the certificate, the official document that declared her a licensed captain. He shook her hand. His grip was firm and strong. He looked her in the eye, and she saw in his face the same quiet respect he had shown her on the bridge of the North Star. It was a silent acknowledgement, a passing of the torch from one captain to another. After the ceremony, as the other graduates celebrated with their families, Tessa slipped away. She had one last thing to do. She walked to the offices of Croft Maritime. It was a huge, modern building of glass and steel that loomed over the port, a symbol of corporate power. She walked into the vast, marble-floored lobby and asked to see Mr. Croft. The receptionist, a woman with a cold, professional smile, looked at her simple clothes and her worn bag with disdain. She was about to refuse when a voice came from behind her. "It's all right. I'll see her." It was Julian. He had been on his way out of the building. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but Tessa could see the flicker of shame in his eyes. He led her up in a silent elevator to his father's office. It was a huge corner office with a panoramic view of the entire harbor. Mr. Croft, The man from the hospital cafeteria, the man with the cold, predatory smile, was sitting behind a massive desk. He looked surprised to see her. Tessa did not wait for him to speak. She placed a single piece of paper on his polished desk. It was a copy of her new captain's license. "The offer you made for my family's ferry route," she said, her voice quiet but as solid as a rock. "The offer is no longer being considered." Mr. Croft looked at the paper, then at her. His cold smile faltered for just a moment. He saw in front of him not a frightened, vulnerable girl, but a competent, confident professional. He saw a captain. He had lost his opportunity. He knew it. Tessa did not wait for his response. She simply turned and walked out of the office, leaving the two Crofts, the father and the son, standing in the silent monument to their own wealth and power. She had won, not by being louder or richer or more powerful, but by being better, by being a better sailor. The journey home was a reversal of all her previous journeys. It was a journey of return, of completion. She took the bus back to the mainland town, but this time the world outside the window did not seem strange or intimidating. It was just a place, a part of a larger world that she was no longer afraid of. When she arrived at the harbor, the tide runner was waiting for her. Her mother and Ben, her friend from the academy, had worked for days to get the ferry ready. They had cleaned it from top to bottom. They had polished the brass in the wheelhouse until it shone. Ben had helped her mother with the engine, making sure it was in perfect working order. He had taken the bus with her, wanting to be there for her first voyage as captain. He was a true friend. Tessa walked up the ramp and onto the familiar steel deck of her family's ferry. It felt like coming home. The boat seemed to welcome her, its familiar groans and creaks a language she knew by heart. She went up to the wheelhouse. The room was clean and orderly. The large wooden wheel seemed to be waiting for her hands. She stood at the window, looking out at the water, just as her father had done so many times. But she was not just looking. She was seeing. She was seeing the currents, the wind, the subtle signs of the weather. She was seeing it all with the eyes of a captain. Her first official voyage as captain of the Tide Runner was not a commercial run. It was a private journey. The only passengers were her mother, Ben, and, a few days later, once he was cleared by his doctor for the short trip, her father. When her father came aboard, it was a moment of profound, unspoken emotion. He walked slowly up the ramp, his steps a little unsteady. He looked around the deck, his eyes taking in every detail of the boat he loved so much. Then he looked at Tessa, who was standing by the wheelhouse door, wearing his old captain's hat. He did not say anything. He just smiled, a real, deep smile that reached his sad eyes and filled them with a brilliant, shining light of pride. He did not try to go into the wheelhouse. He knew it was her place now. He just sat on one of the passenger benches, a quiet, happy observer. Tessa took the helm. She started the engine, and the familiar deep thrum filled the air, a sound of life returning. She guided the Tide Runner out of the mainland harbor, her movements sure and steady. The ferry felt like an extension of her own body. She was in complete control. As they approached Sea Light Island, she saw that the entire village was waiting for them at the dock. The news of her return had spread. The islanders stood in a quiet crowd, their faces full of hope. As the tide runner slid gracefully into its berth, a cheer went up, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The island had its lifeline back. It had its heart back. It had its captain back. In the days and weeks that followed, Tessa settled into her new life. It was a life of routine, of responsibility, of service. She ran the ferry with the same quiet competence and reliability as her father had. The rhythm of the island was restored. The quiet gloom that had settled over the community began to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of hope and connection. Her father did not go back to his chair on the porch. Instead, he would come down to the dock every morning to see her off, and he would be there every evening to welcome her back. He became the unofficial harbinger of the ferry, the keeper of its schedule, a respected elder in the community. He had found a new purpose. He was the captain's father. Tessa's life was not the grand adventure she had once dreamed of, sailing the great oceans and seeing faraway lands. Her world was still the small stretch of water between her island and the mainland. But she no longer felt trapped by it. She had learned that adventure was not about escaping your world. It was about shaping it. She had learned that freedom was not about the absence of responsibility, but about the worthy embrace of it. One evening, after the last crossing of the day, she stood on the deck of the silent, docked ferry, looking out at the sunset. The sky was a brilliant canvas of orange and pink and gold. Her father was on the dock, talking with Finn, the fisherman. Her mother was in the general store, laughing with Mrs. Gable. Ben, who had decided to stay and work with her for a while, was in the engine room, whistling as he worked. Her small island was whole again. It was safe. It was home. Tessa took her father's compass from her pocket. She opened it and watched the needle settle, pointing north. She had found her way. She had not sailed to the distant places on her maps. She had made a different, more difficult journey. She had navigated the stormy seas of grief and fear and self-doubt. And she had brought her ship and her family and her entire community safely into harbor. She was Captain Tessa, the captain of Sea Light Island, and she was finally, truly home.